You're on.
Joaquín está muted. Tienes que quitar el mute de Joaquín. Ya.
Okay.
Buenos días. Good morning. We are going to start this session on the roundtable on the exchange system, on the currency developments and the exchange system of Cuba. We have a very nice group of panelists, very quality people. I will all mention them perhaps in the order in which they will appear. Roberto Orro Fernandez is an independent consultant in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Orro is an economist graduated from the University of Habana, and he also holds a master's degree from the Colegio de Mexico. He has accumulated academic and professional experience in different countries, and his career in the Cuban armed forces in the military, but then he was a lecturer at the University of Havana and then at the University of Guanajuato in Mexico. And he then went to Puerto Rico and became a member of the Calero Consulting Group, an economic and financial consulting firm in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And since 2005, he works as an independent consultant in Puerto Rico. And since 2005, he's a member of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy since 1997. And as a member of the board, he was a member of the board of ASCE from 2008 to 2012. He has made contributions in the field of monetary policy, dollarization in Cuba, and economic and political transition in former socialist countries. He's a certified real estate appraisal and a vice president of the Puerto Rico Association of Financial Analysts. Then after Orro, we will have Pavel Vidal. He's a professor of the Pontificia University Javeriana de Cali, Colombia. He received his doctorate in economics from the University of Havana after completing advanced studies at the University of Oviedo in Spain. He earned his undergraduate degree from the University of Havana, and since 2012 has been a professor of economics at the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana de Cali, Colombia. Previously, he was affiliated with the University of Havana, and before that, he served as an analyst in the Monetary Policy Division of the Central Bank of Cuba. Professor Vidal specialization has been in monetary policy and macroeconomics, with a focus on the structural reforms process in Cuba. One of his areas of expertise is the use of time series econometric models to develop forecasts and estimate economic indices. He has trained with numerous central banks in Latin America and collaborated with scholars and research institutions in various countries. His academic experiences have involved serving as a visiting researcher at Harvard and Columbia Universities in the US, at the University Complutense in Madrid, Spain, and at the Institute of Developing Economics in Japan. Professor Vidal also collaborates with the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, and the Brookings Institution, the Atlantic Council, the United Nations Development Program, and the Banco de la República de Colombia. Next, we'll have Omar Everleny Pérez Villanueva from the Centro Cristiano de Reflexión y Diálogo. He's a doctor in economics from the University of Havana, professor and former director of the Center for the Study of the Cuban Economy at the University of Havana. Has been invited as a professor at Harvard and Columbia Universities in the US and at the universities in Japan, Canada, and France, La Sorbonne, and a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. He has given over 300 lectures about the Cuban economy, both in Cuba and abroad, and authored about 80 articles and a number of books on the Cuban economy. Then we will have Rafael Romeu. Rafael Romeu is the president and CEO of DevTech Systems, Inc. He holds a PhD in International Finance from the Department of Economics of the University of Maryland, College Park. He joined the DevTech from the International Monetary Fund, where he served as the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department in the Fiscal Economic Assignment to Spain. In this capacity, he led discussions on the structural fiscal policy issues arising during the European financial crisis. Before joining the IMF, Dr. Romeu held positions in the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve and at the Central Bank of Venezuela. He has been consulted by the US State Department and the US Department of the Treasury on economic issues in Latin America and the Caribbean. He taught financial theory as a visiting lecturer at the Department of Economics at Yale University, and he has published numerous peer-reviewed journal articles, 2 books on the emergence of retail trading platforms, and he was president of ASCE in the period from 2010 to 2012. Next, we have Lorenzo Pérez. Lorenzo is retired from the International Monetary Fund after 30 years of working in Latin America, Middle East, Central Asia, and African countries. He has consulted with the World Bank Evaluation Group and the IMF Evaluation Office and the Centennial Group from Washington, DC. He also taught international economics at George Washington University. So that covers the panelists. Lorenzo, you want to say something? No, that's it. Well, just to introduce myself then, I am Joaquín Pujol. I'm a macroeconomist, graduated from the Wharton School of Finance and the University of Pennsylvania. I worked in the International Monetary Fund for 29 years until I retired, rising to the position of assistant director in both the Western Hemisphere Department that covers all of Latin America and the Department for the Policy Review, which is the department that controls the quality of the work of the fund. I was involved in negotiations of IMF programs with some 11 Latin American countries during the period that I worked at the IMF. And in particular, I was a head of mission in Mexico during the Mexican debt crisis of 1982-87. And I also served as resident representative for the IMF in Uruguay and as resident advisor in Trinidad and Tobago and to the CARICOM. And I guess that's it. Presentation. So now we can start, and I'm going to ask Roberto Orro to start his presentation.
Pues gracias. Déjenme verificar bien que la puedo poner para que la vea todo el mundo.
Sí.
¿Se ve?
A ver.
No, todavía no.
Frank?
No, todavía. Tienes que compartir share screen.
Ok. Share screen. Aquí. Share. ¿Y ahora?
Ahora sí.
Ahora sí.
Muy bien. Entonces ya estamos ya.
Puedes ponerlo pantalla completa.
Ok. Y se sigue viendo y escuchando, ¿no?
Sí, muy bien.
Sí, sí.
Muy bien, pues estamos entonces. Pues bueno, gracias a todos y sobre todo a los que han trabajado arduamente en la organización de esta conferencia que veo que está siendo muy exitosa. El nombre de nuestra presentación es The US Dollar is Back in Cuba, Chronicle of the Foretold Return. Básicamente, ¿de qué vamos a hablar? Vamos a hablar de describir, basado también en mi experiencia, en mis visitas a Cuba, bueno, The Return, fallacies and wrong assumptions on dollarization and monetary unification in Cuba. And finally, what is next? My conclusion, time is running out for the Cuban peso. Entonces, con respecto a este retorno del dólar, ¿por qué lo pongo entre comillas? Porque nunca se fue. Siempre ha sido realmente el que ha manejado, el comandante, el jefe de la ecuación monetaria del sistema monetario en Cuba. ¿Y por qué? Porque es la moneda preferida del gobierno cubano. No desde 1994, no desde 2019, desde 1960. Toda la vida. ¿Okay? Entonces, ¿qué ha ocurrido? Bueno, pues sabemos que a partir del 2004, pues se hizo todo este rejuego de decir que se desaparecía el dólar y que entonces iba a ser el primer paso para la unificación monetaria, después en el 2013 otro aspaviento de que ahora sí, pero nada. Y el caso es que, pues en el 2019, como todos sabemos, pues de nuevo el gobierno, antes del COVID, empieza a darle fuerza y empieza a expandir de nuevo el uso del dólar en distintas tiendas, habilita varias tiendas para las transacciones en dólar. Finalmente, ya con el asunto, el problema del COVID, pues el dólar sigue ganando fuerza y pues tenemos que el CUC todavía se utiliza for local transaction, but it's no longer useful as a store of value. Entonces, ¿qué está pasando en estos momentos? Bueno, pues que el peso cubano se puede decir que está on life support. The demand for US dollar has exploded. The Cuban people distrust the CUP, es decir, el auténtico Cuban peso, and the CUC. Cuban leaders, y esto es very important, Cuban leaders only trust the US dollar. Independientemente de que el gobierno cubano ha manejado relativamente bien el problema del virus, es mi opinión, lógicamente pues hay un impacto negativo en el turismo, los remittances and the economy in general. Es decir, que tenemos en estos momentos una perfecta tormenta para el peso cubano, donde hay una stronger demand with a limited supply of US dollar. Esto es una gráfica que más o menos ilustra, esto es con los datos que he tenido oficial, cómo era precisamente el cambio del CUC con el dólar. ¿Por qué? Porque el CUC siempre ha sido, la idea del CUC era un elemento impositivo, era una herramienta para extraer más dólares a los visitantes. Es decir, que en el 2004, por un CUC se podía obtener 1.2 dólares. En el periodo del 2012-2019, pues empieza a mermar, el mercado negro empieza a ganar fuerza, algo que no ocurría entre el 2004 y el 2012. El mercado negro empieza a ganar fuerza y ya empezaba a bajar. Y finalmente, y por eso es que viene ya toda esta, fíjense que en el 2012 iba bajando y ahí es donde en el 2013 las autoridades cubanas vienen con la idea de la unificación, que no es otra cosa en el fondo que literalmente una pataleta contra la pérdida de poder y eficacia del CUC. Y finalmente, bueno, pues ya por las situaciones que todos sabemos, ya en estos momentos, al contrario, no tiene el poder impositivo del CUC es mínimo y lo que se puede obtener en el mercado negro por un CUC es 0.8 dólares. Entonces, básicamente sabemos que, estoy repitiendo, es decir, el famoso día cero, en mi opinión, pues fue otro truco para tratar de sacar más CUCs de circulación. Nunca hubo realmente, el gobierno cubano decía que quería una unificación, pero nunca estableció realmente un cronograma, una hoja de ruta.
Roberto, can you switch to English, please?
Okay, a roadmap for unification never carefully laid out. And the government critique of the dual system was in effect a complaint about the weakness of the CUC. Entonces, let's talk about fallacies and wrong assumptions on the Cuban dollarization. First, monetary dualism or monetary troika. Cuban monetary system is a troika rather than a dual system. At the top, US dollar. In the middle, CUC as a buffer and taxation tool and as a way to prevent compromising government's US dollar reserves. At the bottom, a CUP. CUC has worn out, has lost taxation power, and has a disruptive effect on the supply chains of the economy. This is another fallacy, wrong assumption. Monetary dualism introduced economic distortion. False. If it were true, we would have to conclude that Cuba had a more efficient monetary system in the 80s during the cost of the Centro planning and the honeymoon with the Soviet Union. The artificial rate of 1-to-1 was not an invention in the early 90s. It had existed for 5 decades. And the exchange rate labyrinth was complicated by the system of bartering with Council for Mutual Economic Assistance member countries. Dollarization started in the early 90s and ended in 2004. False. Since 1960, Cuba has lacked a convertible currency. Monetary dualism did not start in 1993. That year, Cuban citizens were simply allowed to hold and use US dollars. Cuba had its own Berrioscas, dollarized network, dollarized stores before 1993. And in 2004, the government withdrew US dollar from circulation as a way to protect national dollar reserves. Monetary dualism is just the mirror of economic duality, an inherent feature of most centralized economies. Monetary dualism hampered exports, led to crash of sugar industry. It's not my opinion. Importers not enjoy a preferential rate, nor do they have free access to hard currencies. Most imported goods end up in the dollarized network, TRD, CEMEX, etc. Had the government opened the sugar industry and the agro sector to foreign investment, as it did with tourism, nickel, and more recently, ports, the sugar industry would have retained its competitive edge. Another fallacy, monetary dualism is exacerbated in an egalitarian society. No, Cuba has never been a truly egalitarian society, free of social disparity, even from 1959 to 1993. Top officials enjoyed privileges and economic conditions unthinkable for the Cuban people. The legalization of the US dollar in 1993 cut the traditional link between economic prosperity and political loyalty. Something for me is very important. And now social differences are more visible than before, but this is not the same as saying that Cubans were better during the 80s. What is next? Time is running out for the Cuban peso. The dollarization and economic power of the Cuban army. Although the Cuban armed forces remain a public institution, its commercial arm resembles large Latin American holding companies. GAE, TRD, Gaviota, CEMEX, armed forces, and their foreign investment partners share aversion for CUP and affection for US dollars. And they will never embark in a monetary adventure with the CUP. If it's not broken, don't fix it. The inconvenience of monetary unification. The government army and their powerful holding companies will never take exchange rates. So it's crucial to understand why the unification has not taken place, and in my opinion, it will never take place. A number of options are unfeasible. Coming back to the economic apartheid of the 80s and 90s is irrational, since more and more ordinary citizens have access to US dollars and other hard currencies. The wide use of the CUP will lead to a worse mess of preferential exchange rates, privilege to purchase US dollars, and differentiation between foreign investors, among other problems. Discouraging news from overseas. That's another problem for the Cuban peso, part of the perfect storm I mentioned. Since 2018, emerging market currencies have suffered great pain. Investors are obsessed with US bonds and FANG stocks. During the COVID crisis, the Fed provided some relief via swaps to Latin American central banks. Another question, are Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil doing better than Panama, El Salvador, and Ecuador in economic terms? This is a question for you, the experts in international institutions. Monetary unification. Monetary unification in CUP is just a dream so far. Cuba missed a great opportunity to advance the unification goal during 2008-2012, when petrodollars were flowing from Venezuela. Quite the contrary, dollarization has spread to Venezuela. Now, in the midst of a very adverse economic situation, local as well as external, Cuba lacks the backstop needed to overhaul the CUP. Monetary unification. The Cuban leadership and the political system in general stand against the CUP. Cuban leaders have a strong addiction to US dollars and a strong aversion to CUP. Raúl Castro's succession plans keep moving on, very important, and people are getting used to a new leadership. Whatever the outcome in the next US election, and in spite of potential unrest, the Communist Party, their leaders, and the Cuban system in general will retain its grip on the Cuban society. Nobody in the US wants a political earthquake in Cuba. Who wins, who loses? It depends on the benchmark. The Cuban government is the biggest winner. Its hedge faces no exchange rate risk. Cuban workers whose salaries are paid in CUCs and have no access to US dollars are the biggest losers, of course. But, however, cuentapropistas and many Cubans with access to US dollar also gain with dollar comeback. And finally, questions that must be answered. Who or what is going to force the Cuban leadership to end its 60-year dependence on the US dollar? Let's assume that the CUP is restored as the only currency. How will Cuban leaders react if they lose money due to exchange rate movements? Who is going to provide a financial backstop to create and develop an independent monetary authority? What about transition cost, a competent staff, and other related issues? Millions of Cubans and foreigners with stakes in Cuba are used to operating in foreign currency without facing exchange risk. Who or what can change that? Conclusions. The Cuban government has no real incentives to embark on a risky and complicated monetary unification. The CUP is at its own level a transition scenario, with CUP restored as true national currency is hard to imagine. That's all. Hello?
I would hold off on questions right now, but I will ask Pavel Vidal to say some words. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I'm just going to present something very briefly to let some time for the Q&A session. First, thanks Joaquín for inviting me to this panel, but I have to say that I never expected to be in 2020 talking about the monetary duality in Cuba, because I'm going to defy one of the idea of Orro, that there wasn't any plan to unify the monetary system in Cuba. I worked for the Central Bank of Cuba since 1999 or to 2006, and we did have a plan to unify the monetary system to advance in exchange rate correction. Finally, it didn't happen, but we did a plan. So maybe the conclusion that there is not a clear incentive to go back to the Cuban peso is right, but what we have to, what we need to answer is the question of why this is taking so long. Because we know that the exchange rate correction, the exchange rate unification, which is even more important than the currency unification, is something that is going to happen at some time. So they are just prolonging the inevitable. They are just postponing this exchange rate correction because the implication that it is going to have for the profitability of the state-owned enterprises, and this required a liberalization of the private sector that could absorb the unemployment that will come after a significant depreciation of the exchange rate that restructured the state-owned enterprises. So I agree that this is I would put it like this is a diversion, because the CUC was meant to be the transition currency to a unified currency system, and this happened to be the transition currency between dollarization and re-dollarization, which was never the purpose of the CUC. So I think it's important. Maybe the title of the panel is correct. Currency development. Maybe we have to stop talking about for the years to come about the monetary unification, but because about the currency unification, but this is not going to happen if they just introduced the US dollar. It means that this is going to stick around for a while. So we better, I mean, the Cuban government is saying that they are going to desempolvar the economic policies of the 90s. Maybe we will have to desempolvar our papers, our analysis of the Cuban economy in the 90s, recycle those papers and update it, because this is going in the same direction, because we know that the dollarization is a short-term relief, but it doesn't guarantee a sustainable and inclusive long-term economic growth, created many segmentations, distortions in the economy, and we have many papers talking about that, and maybe we'll have to update it and use it again. So let me share my screen. Just try to use two indices that I presented yesterday. Can you see it?
Yes, we could see it until monetary policy index, GDP. The first 4 lines in the bottom, we could see it, not the rest.
Okay, that's weird, but I don't know how to fix it. But you can see the chart, maybe the trajectory that I'm going to present. So these are 2 indices that I computed to resume, to synthesize the stance of monetary policy and fiscal policy over a period from 1985 up to 2019. Notice that I am not including in this in this period 2020, because we don't know what is going to happen with the fiscal budget. We don't know what is exactly happening with the inflation rate. Omar Everleny did an important observation of some key products that he needs in his everyday life, and he came out with a very worrying rate of inflation of this very small basket of food, but I think it's very informative. So I'm not including 2020. This is the situation before coronavirus arrived. I used the idea with these indices is to not to focus in a data point, but in a trend of different variables that are providing information about the stance of monetary and fiscal policy. I'm using a dynamic factor model to find the co-movement among a few key variables. In the fiscal index, I am including the total fiscal expenditure, the subsidies to state-owned enterprises, the fiscal deficit, these 3 variables as a proportion of the GDP. And I am also including the average salary in the state sector. In the monetary policy index, I am including the money supply, the money circulation, the amount of saving accounts in Cuban peso for individuals, also as a percentage of the GDP. The official, not including aquí the Everleny data point of 2020, just including the official consumer price index and the exchange rate of the Cuban peso to the dollar. What we can see in the trajectory of the fiscal index is the peak in the early 90s, associated with a highly expansionary position or stance from the fiscal policy. Then we have this important correction that we call it at that time the medidas de saneamiento financiero. Then we have a period of relative fiscal stability from 1995 up to 2005. Then we have this rapprochement with Venezuela, the battle of idea, this produced an expansion of the added accommodation to the fiscal policy stand, leading to the 2008 financial crisis in Cuba, our own domestic financial crisis. Then you see from 2009 on that it was clear the rebalance rebalancing that Raúl Castro enforced on the main macroeconomic or fiscal equilibrium. And then finally, since 2015, you see this upward trend that is meaning that fiscal policy has been accumulating, accommodation has been accumulating significant deficits. With the monetary policy index, we have the same story. They move in tandem because we monetize the fiscal deficits, which imply a direct connection between the fiscal policy deficit and the position or stance of the monetary policy. And you see at the end the same trend, the same worrying trend. We are not yet in the level of the same imbalances that we had in the 90s, but we are heading in that direction. And we have to wait to see what are going to be the imbalances in 2020. And then we will have the chance to compare it with the special period. And what I want to take away from this data is that dollarization and re-dollarization always occurred during a period of imbalances. I mean, dollarization is a consequence of a mismanagement of fiscal and monetary policy. It's a consequence of disequilibrium in the fiscal and monetary front. High inflation that reduce credibility in the national currency, reduce the convertibility of the national currency, which undermine the quality of the currency to facilitate a normal operation of the international trade and payment of the foreign debt. And for that reason, the government decided to use the dollar to isolate some sectors from these from all these problems associated to the national currency. So the dollarization is a decision that has to do with the macroeconomic imbalances. It's not something that that is coming out of the blue. It has connection with the macroeconomic imbalances, and you can see that the de-dollarization happened after 10 consecutive years of a relative sustainable or balanced stance of the two indices. You see they are flat within 10 years. So that allowed the central bank to reestablish the confidence in the national currency. They had at that time the CUC that was backed up by a currency board, and that allowed the government to de-dollarize the economy. So I think that when we talk about dollarization and re-dollarization and de-dollarization, we have to take into account the macroeconomic, the fiscal and monetary stance in each period and the relation with the decision that the central bank and the government is taking. So I better leave it here, and we can come back to this debate in the Q&A session. So thank you.
I am going to ask Omar Everleny to continue with his ideas. Yes, thank you.
¿Ya se escucha?
Sí.
¿Ya se escucha?
Sí,
ya.
Sí.
Bueno, como habíamos quedado, yo voy a hacer mi pequeña presentación en español. Primero quisiera mencionar, aunque ha habido otros paneles, muy rápidamente, la situación económica de Cuba. O sea, Cuba tuvo en el año 2019 momentos de grandes tensiones, sin saber todavía que iba a aparecer el COVID. El crecimiento de ese año en la economía fue apenas un 0,5%, pero el promedio de los últimos 5 años nunca había sobrepasado el 2%, o sea, hay un promedio bajo, y a eso se le suman todas las dificultades desde el punto de vista externo, es decir, los ingresos por exportaciones de servicios médicos caen, por el cierre de algunos convenios, las exportaciones de bienes como el azúcar caen, es decir, estamos en un momento en que hubo que pagar deudas provenientes de los acuerdos de renegociación con el Club de París, o sea, intereses que hubo que pagar. Realmente el país tenía una situación bastante compleja y eso hace que ya en el plan 2019 hay un recorte fuerte de las importaciones. Por otro lado, en Cuba existe un nivel de liquidez muy alto. Podemos decir que ya en el año 2018 la liquidez de la población con respecto al PIB es un 59%. La pregunta, ¿en manos de quién está ese dinero? Todos sabemos que no está realmente distribuido como el Estado piensa que estaba. Sin embargo, hay cifras que dicen que había más de 1.700.000 personas que son vulnerables. Son las estadísticas que se dan hasta el 2008, lo que representa el 15.6% de los habitantes. En otro sentido, aunque no se ha querido decir nunca, hay en Cuba una clase media que estaba en auge, a pesar de todas las críticas que hay, sí, ya la sociedad cubana no es la misma. Y ya comienza el 2020 primero con unos meses de una gran desaceleración del turismo. O sea, los primeros 3 o 4 meses, sin llegar el COVID, hay una desaceleración de los ingresos por turismo. Y ya sabemos que después de abril ha sido casi nulo la llegada de turistas. No hay turistas hasta el día de hoy y ha sido o era la fuente importante de ingresos al país. Por otro lado, al bajar las importaciones, no solo de bienes de consumo, sino las importaciones de materias primas, se produjo realmente una baja en las producciones agrícolas e industriales y eso llevó a una crisis de escasez. Y esa crisis de escasez se manifiesta evidentemente en las grandes colas que hay en todas las tiendas del país. Y eso sumó entonces la llegada del COVID, que entonces lo complicó todo. Eso ha llevado a que el país ha tenido que hacer muchos gastos para sectores como salud, para hacerle frente a esta pandemia, no solo desde la asistencia a las personas enfermas o que no estén enfermos, pero para saber que tienen el COVID, sino a los gastos que ha habido que hacer para investigación de nuevos fármacos. Ya se está comentando que ya hay una vacuna cubana que está en fase experimental y eso lleva recursos, ustedes conocen. Por lo tanto, Cuba llega en crisis a la nueva crisis provocada por el COVID. Entonces, ¿qué hacer? Bueno, lo primero que se ocurrió, y creo que fue razonable en ese momento, una medida muy pragmática, fue racionar los productos escasos. Entre ellos, productos de aseo, productos de alimentos, que no se distribuían a nivel de la cartilla de racionamiento clásica desde el año 62, que estaban jabón, pastas de dientes, esas cosas volvieron a racionarse. Se le garantizó un 60% a las personas que perdieron empleo, se cerró el curso escolar, se empezó a llevarle comida a las personas de avanzada edad ya elaborada. Y una de las medidas que habían funcionado, y ya han comentado los dos panelistas anteriores, fue ampliar los surtidos en las tiendas en MLC, que fueron creadas en el segundo semestre del 2019 para efecto electrodoméstico, un poco para evitar que las remesas que estaban llegando a Cuba volvieran a salir hacia los mercados de México, Panamá y otros mercados, el Estado lo pudiera recoger ese dinero y se creó ese mercado. Funcionaba bastante bien y con la propia crisis lo que se hace es entonces incorporar los alimentos y aseo personal, que ya se ha explicado el tema de ella. Ha habido muchas propuestas de economistas y si uno se pone a leer la literatura de los últimos años, aunque siempre se escribió sobre temas de economía cubana, muchas de las medidas que se han tenido que desempolvar, como decía Pavel, y se han tenido que sacar, ya estaban escritas y estaban propuestas. Lo que había que definir qué fecha había que ponerla, porque para nadie le cabe duda de que la pequeña y mediana empresa es algo que hay que tomar en cuenta, que estaban aprobados los documentos del partido. Todo el mundo, incluyendo Pavel, escribimos durante mucho tiempo la necesidad de ampliar los oficios y los trabajos por cuenta propia. Y sin una lista, yo creo que eso es fundamental. Ahora la duda, ¿qué criterios seguirán para aprobar cualquier iniciativa? Si por otro lado no han clarificado qué es lo que no se puede hacer. Entonces, lo primero que tienen que clarificar es, no quiero en esto, en esto y en esto, un poco las propuestas vayan en ese sentido, porque si no realmente, ¿cuál es el nivel de discrecionalidad para aprobar una iniciativa a otra? O sea, ¿qué es lo que yo puedo proponer o no puedo proponer? Pero por lo menos ya reconocieron que no podían estar aprobando un oficio, otro segundo oficio, etc. Otra de las medidas que se han planteado con fuerza es acelerar la implantación de las pymes, pero no hay una fecha precisa para eso, no hay un documento, no hay una ley, no hay nada, aunque se ha comentado que en octubre realmente se va a producir una Asamblea Nacional para debatir todo lo que se divulgó en unas sesiones que hubo, unas mesas redondas, específicamente la del 16 de julio de este año. Pero no hay, claro, no hay precisión. Ahora, es una buena medida en cuanto al objetivo. Vamos a desarrollar las pymes. Bueno, perfecto. Ahora, ¿cómo se va a hacer? Es el gran cuestionamiento. Por otro lado, se autorizó a los privados a comprar en ciertos mercados mayoristas, como Mercaval. Funciona más o menos bien. El otro día dieron una entrevista que realmente en el mercado más grande, que está ahí en Nuevo Vedado, han habido más de 300 clientes que son dueños de negocios, sobre todo del área de alimentación, que se han inscrito y realmente lo otro que se ha permitido es que los privados exporten o importen a través del Estado. Ahora, ¿con qué eficiencia van a trabajar esas empresas en las cuales hay que importar y exportar? ¿Van a ser las mismas que no fueron eficientes con las empresas estatales? ¿O ya por trabajar con el privado van a ser un poco más eficientes? Eso habría que verlo sobre la práctica. Pero es una medida que podemos decir que es una buena medida. No podemos criticar como la medida de que está mala. El problema es la ejecución. La práctica, ¿cómo es? Porque no ha sido. Entonces, la gran pregunta, ¿y por qué tienen que ser estatales? No pueden haber otro tipo de entidades. Pero el hecho de haber reconocido la necesidad de poner esas empresas, a mí me parece que es un paso importante. Por otro lado, se ha aprobado reiniciar la aprobación de las cooperativas no agrícolas. Nosotros nos llamó mucho la atención que hace un año decían que después de 7 años de experimentos, todavía no hemos llegado a una conclusión para seguir desarrollando las cooperativas no agrícolas. Y ahora de pronto aparecen que la van a desarrollar. Entonces, era lógico que había que desarrollarla, pero eso se ha quedado así, todavía no hay una fecha, no hay una conclusión. A mí me parece muy importante las cooperativas no agrícolas, sobre todo en la construcción. O sea, una ciudad que tiene tantos problemas de construcción, como que se paralizó la aprobación de las cooperativas no agrícolas. Y si uno recuerda, hace más de 7 años no se aprueba ninguna cooperativa. Lo otro que se ha comentado mucho, y en esa misma reunión del 16 de julio, la eliminación de acopios. Pero es que toda la vida los economistas nos dimos cuenta que no podía haber un monopolio de una sola empresa que sea la que compre, la que venda, y además los precios que le pone el campesino. Y ya se ha planteado, vamos a eliminar acopios. Pero bueno, ¿cuál es la alternativa? ¿Haber 5 acopios o haber empresas de segundo grado cooperativas como realmente se estructuraron? Lo otro que se habló mucho es flexibilizar el plan económico del 2021. A mí me parece que es muy bueno. La gran pregunta, me están flexibilizando el plan económico hace 5 años y dicen, este año va a ser diferente, va a ser diferente. Ahora habría que ver qué conceptos o qué elementos tenemos para que el año 2021 sea un plan diferente. En el diseño y en la implementación no estoy en contra. Lo que estoy diciendo es que si ha habido varios años donde el plan se ha dicho que es muy verticalista, muy centralista, etcétera, etcétera, ¿cómo me vas ahora a decir que el 21 va a ser totalmente diferente? ¿Con qué recursos? Bueno, si pasamos a la época del 93 o el año 94, cuando se descentralizó la economía, a mí me parece bien. Por otro lado, se dice darle mayor potestad a los directivos. Yo creo que sí, hay que darle una mayor potestad a los directivos y que no dejen de ser de administradores de recursos a gerentes. Ahora, con la práctica que se ha seguido hasta ahora, habría que ver qué se le llama darle mayor potestad a los directivos. Es decir, en el menú de opciones no es nada nuevo de lo que se ha escrito, se ha debatido en los últimos años, pero que lo hayan dicho que realmente tienen una fecha de cumplimiento antes de abril del próximo año, donde hay que llegar al Congreso del Partido con la mayor parte de los acuerdos aprobados que no se han aprobado, yo creo que es una forma muy rápida para ver los resultados. Es decir, a pesar de todas estas cosas, que en sí, cuando uno se pone a leer la letra de las cosas que han dicho, a mí me parece positivo. Mi duda es, todo se hay que medirlo no por esfuerzo, sino por resultados. Y entonces, por otro lado, quieres desarrollar las pequeñas y medianas empresas, pero la Constitución te dice no habrá concentración de la riqueza. Bueno, eso hay que definirlo. Hay que definirlo porque si yo creo una primera empresa y me funciona, vamos a poner bien. Y de pronto se me ocurre crear la segunda empresa y me funciona bien y un día viene y me dice, ya usted se hizo rico. Bueno, rico en base a qué número. O sea, eso hay que clarificarlo porque no son cosas así y ya ha habido experiencias negativas en la historia económica de Cuba. Entonces, ¿quién me garantiza que una pequeña empresa aprobada que pueda importar maquinarias del exterior no se desarrolle de una forma que no se vea bien vista por el Estado después, por el nivel de liquidez que tiene, el enriquecimiento? Entonces, ahí empieza entonces lo económico y lo político. Es lo que yo puedo decir hasta ahí, porque realmente de lo único que ha habido concreción de las nuevas medidas que se han propuesto para este año han sido las tiendas en MLC. Y los resultados han sido buenos. Es decir, todavía se observa que en Cuba había una reserva importante de dólares, porque físicamente no entra un dólar a Cuba desde marzo de este año. Y sin embargo, hay colas en MLC. O sea, hay todavía reservas. Yo lo pude ayer ir a una tienda antes de llegar a esta conferencia para observarlo. Y en 70 habían, primera y 70 de las 4 grandes tiendas de La Habana, había más de 200 personas en MLC. Yo pensé, eso se agota en la primera semana o dos. No, la gente sigue teniendo dólares. Puede ser que de Europa manden algo, pero estoy pensando que el 85% de las remesas venían de Estados Unidos. Entonces, ¿qué pasará cuando ya empiecen a abrirlo de nuevo los aviones y todo el mundo a traer parte de la remesa, que una gran parte era persona a persona? Entonces, esa es mi preocupación. Es decir, había una reserva grande en el país. Y eso fue relacionado con lo que ustedes han planteado anteriormente, los dos que me han precedido. Es que como iba a cambiar el CUC, la gente empezaron a atesorar en dólares porque tenían miedo que perdiera el valor después con el CUC. Y ahora todas esas reservas que se crearon están guardadas. Y realmente yo pensé que iba a subir muy rápidamente el cambio y por lo menos en la zona donde yo vivo se mantiene alrededor de 1.20, 1.25. Y es curioso también observar cómo hay personas que todavía tienen dólares en Cuba que lo están vendiendo si el familiar deposita en una cuenta que tiene en Estados Unidos 1.25. O sea, están sacando los dólares para Cuba, dándole posibilidad a alguien que gaste esos dólares en Cuba. Sí, él tiene dólares y no quiere gastarlo en alimentos. Y lo que quiere es vendérselo a quien que lo quiera gastar en alimentos, ganando un 25%. Es un fenómeno fuera de... Ya, el otro día me propusieron, pongo $5,000 en Estados Unidos, pero si me lo pagan a 1.25. ¿Y qué tú entregas aquí? Dólares. Le digo, ¿cómo es eso? Es un país muy curioso, con muchas incertidumbres, muchas cosas que realmente te da una idea de lo complejo que está haciendo este segundo semestre de la economía. Dice que se está trabajando, lo sé, hay muchas comisiones trabajando, hay mucha gente proponiendo, pero en la concreta no hay ningún documento que te diga, este es el decreto ley para el desarrollo de esta tal actividad. Hasta ahí mi presentación. ¿Sí? Ya terminé.
I'm going to ask then now Rafael Romeu to make the next comentario and presentation. Thank you. Rafael?
Okay, thank you, Joaquín. Let me see if I can host up panelists. Okay. Okay, so I should be sharing my screen, correct?
Yes.
Yes, we could see it.
Super. So thank you to Larry Katabacker and Sylvia and Joaquín and everyone who organized this this conference and this presentation, and of course to all my fellow panelists. Rafael Romeu, I'm the president of DevTech Systems. I'm very grateful to be here. What I've been asked to speak about is one of the more important, or let's call it the more high-profile proposals. And it's high-profile principally because it came from the World Bank to unify this currency issue in Cuba, the unification of the CUC, the CUC, the convertible peso, and the peso normal, peso cubano. And this was floated, it was developed over a number of years in the World Bank, and they consulted with the fund, and in particular with me and a couple other people who work on Cuba, who are all ASCE people like Gabriel Di Vela and Andy Wolf, and a broader team at the IMF. IMF never put a proposal forward, but the World Bank put this forward. So it is there's a paper by Augusto de la Torre and Alan Ise out there. This was actually discussed in Cuba. It's been discussed in a number of places. I'm going to go through it at the behest of Joaquín, and basically, I think it's unusual to present someone else's or some other institution's work without them being here, but you can rest assured that all of the comments I give here on their work, I gave them in person in 2013 and 2014. And so this is not a critique they haven't heard before. So what I'll talk about is the background on this proposal, the recommendations, and really how I find this proposal to be deeply flawed, and I'll tell you why. It has administrative difficulties, economic difficulties, and then add to those difficulties of the current situation, and you can just see how really all of the discussion that the panelists have put forward, I agree with, and basically the official sector of the IFIs of the United States has had no answer. Well, of the global community, I shouldn't say the United States. To this, because without fundamental reform, it's very difficult to really envision any sort of currency unification or anything that would approximate that. So let me talk about this proposal. The World Bank assigned or allowed Augusto de la Torre and co-author to, he was at the time, the reason I mentioned his name is he was at the time the chief economist for Latin America and the Caribbean. So this was an official position of the World Bank to go forward with this. They went to Cuba, they discussed it. They also presented this proposal at Bildner, at the Peterson Institute, at Brookings. They did not present it at ASCE, which I think is a deeply flawed strategy if you want to put forward a proposal on Cuba. But it was very high profile. And they went to Cuba, and they also discussed it with the IMF, where I think it was a brave attempt. I think they gave it a shot, but without addressing the fundamental inconsistencies in the Cuban economy, their proposal, of course, faces challenges that are insurmountable by any exchange rate policy. And that's really where I'm going to focus in. And there were internal presentations to the fund. So again, these are discussions that we had with them, and, you know, trying to do this in a vacuum is very hard. And I put the link there in case you want to read the paper of Dr. De La Torre, which is a very interesting approach. So the first, let me talk about the approach. So the proposal calls for basically unify the entire exchange rate at 24-to-1, and then create a system by which, if you are a hotel and you get a massive windfall, so if you're a hotel and you earned $1 from a tourist, and then you last year sold that dollar to the Central Bank of Cuba and received a CUC, the convertible peso, you would the following year under the unified currency receive 25 pesos. So that would be a massive windfall to you. You would win. What the proposal from the World Bank would do then is look at the central bank registry of Cuba and go in and do a lump sum tax on that hotel and tax 24 of the new pesos away and leave them with one ordinary Cuban peso for their $1. And that's how they unify at 25-to-1, but then subtract the 24 extra from people who were net long dollars, who had dollars because they earned, and then use that money to pay for the people who imported last year, who were given access to dollars at 1-to-1, and now have to pay 25-to-1. And so basically, this was a massive reunification of the currency at 25-1, an overt recognition of this devaluation, but then you redistribute the gains from the winners to the challenges that the losers in this devaluation face. So that was essentially the proposal. And what it would do is look at, imagine a hotel. Imagine that hotel had $100. That means next year they have 2,500 pesos for that $100 of earning. You go in and you tax 2,400 of it. You take that money, it's a lump sum tax, and you redistribute it to the state-owned firms and others that need to import. And so you can reallocate your dollars through a system of taxation, but allow everyone to recognize on their balance sheets a 25-1 exchange rate. That is the heart of their proposal, and they recommended this as a sort of big bang unification, but you amortize the shock through this system of cross subsidization, and you do this temporarily for 3 years or something like that, and you phase out. And the idea is that because it's a lump sum tax, there's no distortions, et cetera, et cetera. But mind you, and I'll go through the issues that I see with this, and you'll understand some of the issues. So number one, if you're going to do this, the proposal by the World Bank is, this is easy to do because you can just look at who bought dollars last year at the Central Bank of Cuba, and you have a list of who you need to tax. And so if I am Sol Meliá and I earn a bunch of dollars and I sell them to the central bank, I know exactly their revenue because you sold everything to them. You can then tax them next year when they're getting paid this massive amount of pesos, which would be like Cook. You could walk into a store in Cuba, there would no longer be Cook stores, there would be only peso stores. And so they would have 25 times the purchasing power that they had the prior year. So you go in and you tax it and you remove that purchasing power. Okay, so what is the problem with that? Even if you believe that that's feasible, the problem is that you go from a system of 2 prices that is distorting to a system of N taxes. So administratively, this is a nightmare because every firm has an individual tax, which is based on their history of currency sales. Imagine having to go in company by company and taxing them one by one based on what they bought last year from the central bank in terms of pesos and their dollar earnings. So in this case, N is the number of taxes that you have to issue, and it equals, at minimum, the number of firms in Cuba that access central bank dollars in the prior year. That is literally the proposal of the World Bank. And this proposal is attacking the firm level exchange rate transactions in Cuba. It does not attack the worker or the cuenta propista level or the sort of individual private citizen level. And so if somehow that taxation needs to flow down from firm level taxation to individual level taxation, that number N could be quite large because now you're talking about taxi drivers or you name it. Those people would also, if they earn in dollars, have a 25-fold windfall under this approach. So this system just administratively seems unwieldy. It seems like this is not going to work. Venezuela, of course, has multiple exchange rates. It has these cards that it uses to identify the citizen and how much the citizen is entitled to, et cetera, et cetera. It is just, Orwellian, and it is faltering and so on. And so administratively, this is a non-starter in my view. Second, the proposal assumes firms will pay this tax. So it doesn't seem to incorporate rational expectations. And when we brought this to them very directly and said, this is insane, they said, well, we can use the law to administer this. And so here's the issue. Let's say you are Sol Meliá and I am Hilton. And in an imaginary world where this occurs, Sol Meliá opens its hotel on January 1, 2020, and receives a 96% tax, lump sum tax on its foreign currency earnings. And along comes, you know, I do a joint venture with Omar Everleny, and we open a new hotel right next door that has no exchange rate history with the central bank. And we have the same number of visitors as Sol Meliá, and I don't have that 96% tax rate. So new entities have no basis for taxation. How are you taxing them? Is it an average rate for the industry? Do I look like Sol Meliá and you tax me what they did? How are you taxing new firms that enter the market? And if that's the case, why don't the old firms just shut down and start a new firm or leave? And so the proposal, I put the language right here, suggests that to get around this 96% asymmetric taxation regime, what you do is you turn to international legal instruments. Let me quote directly. It says, la manera más sencilla de evitar que el operador incumpla con el pago impuesto lump sum sería recurrir a contratos sujetos a jurisdicciones internacionales, lo cual permitiría al gobierno cubano exigir legalmente que los operadores cumplan con sus compromisos y ya sea que abandonen a Cuba o no. So this exchange rate, let me paraphrase in English, is suggesting that they will confiscate 96% of the windfall even if you try to exit Cuba, and they will do so through, for example, international venues, courts in New York and London, presumably. Now, that N, remember big N, number of taxation regimes, now also becomes big N number of international arbitration processes that you have to set in motion. DevTech has some experience with very high profile bankruptcies like the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, a couple others. This is not something you want to do even on a one international arbitration process. Can set you back for a decade. If you have to do N of them, if you want to go to war with every international chain in Cuba right now, that would be, in my view, a very difficult proposition to have. Finally, the current outlook makes it hard to do half measures. And this in my view is, again, the principal difficulty is that you are attempting to unify an exchange rate, and where I think the World Bank should have been more aggressive in its proposal is to underlie, to be transparent about the underlying misalignments in policy, the policy misalignments that are driving this duality of exchange rate, which you guys have discussed ad nauseum. So the deficit this year, this is the Gaceta Oficial, which is a wonderful document that Cuba publishes every year that gives you its deficit in pesos. Of course, we don't know because of the accounting difficulties. Some of this economy is denominated in coups and some in coups. But regardless, roughly speaking, we're talking about a deficit of 7 billion, which is roughly, depending on how you look at it, 7-8% of their GDP. This is monetized, right? As Pavel very clearly showed, this is the fiscal expansion in Pavel's index. It is financed by printing money. As a result of that, that's why they don't unify, because this is a vehicle through which they confiscate whatever assets are available inside the Cuban economy to reallocate towards their fiscal policy. That's the first issue. They have that misalignment. The second issue is that Venezuela has gone from being in the asset column to the liability column. And we show, I have a paper with Rodolfo Mendez of BBVA, Jose Pineda of UBC and DevTech, and myself, where we take the very official low growth rates of Cuba, which are I don't want to use anything other than official data. And even with that, you could do a state space decomposition and show that there's a bunch of things that drive growth in Cuba, but Venezuela is not one of them anymore. The blue area in this graph is Venezuela pulling growth down, really starting since 2014. And the reason is that oil went from about $100 a barrel after the global financial crisis in the years 2011 to 2013 to about $50 a barrel in 2014. And that is enough really strike the imbalances in Venezuela. You don't need it to go to you know, if you're at $65 a barrel, that's a problem for Venezuela. At $30 or $40 a barrel where we are now, they're on their deathbed. But you already had these problems before, starting as early as 2014. And of course, the final nail in the coffin on this idea is the global financial, or the global pandemic and the lockdown, when you have actual decrees stopping economic activity because of this pandemic, and because you have the need to fight the spread of this virus, and you do so with very blunt instruments, which are stop all economic activity and keep everyone at home. Whatever productivity gains you hope to eke out of the Cuban economy to help you know, generate value that you can use to unify the currency are gone. I mean, everything is gone. So really, this speaks to the absence of resilience of a proposal to unify currency. I think Pavel and Roberto and Omar have been very clear on the insolvency of the current position and the need to move to the dollar as a step back from unification rather than a step forward, and so a proposal like this is just frankly not very robust to a shock. This is a big shock, but already you had problems coming. So those are my comments on what the official sector, what the IFIs, IMF did never put a proposal forward, although we did. IMF staff did a lot of work. We have important papers by Gabriel, myself, Andy Wolf, that talk about this duality, but the World Bank did take a step. However, the step was I think, lacking some of the macro fundamentals that break this. So I'll stop there. Joaquín, you're on mute.
Oops. Yeah. Mute or mute? Hello?
Yeah, we hear you.
You can hear me. Okay, I'm going to ask Lorenzo Pérez to be the next participant to say something. And I think he can say something about the experience with other countries and what implications it has for Cuba. Thank you.
Thank you, Joaquín, for the invitation. And I'm very happy to be in this panel, and it has been very interesting so far. I'm going to make two types of comments. One that follows a bit Pavel and Rafael talk a bit, you know, about Cuba, the situation in Cuba. And then I'm going to talk about examples of exchange rate crisis, of exchange rate management that I was involved in my career in the fund, and what does that mean for Cuba. But as a means of introduction to the 3 or 4 cases I'm going to be discussing, I fully agree that, you know, the situation, you know, you see dollarization, re-dollarization is a function of the macro policies that the country has. So now we see the dollarization because things seems to be out of control and there's no confidence on the domestic currency. But the important thing regarding Cuba or any other country is that you have to have a complete program. You cannot talk about dollarization or not, or devaluing this or that without talking about the macro policy behind. So you really have to have a comprehensive macro policy, and part of that is the exchange rate management. In Cuba, I remember when Raúl Castro officially began talking when he took over the presidency about what he called monetary unification, he clearly said, we have to wait because we have to allow the enterprises adjust before we do the unification. What does that mean? That meant that there were many enterprises that were getting very favorable exchange rates and were being subsidized by the state, and they could not take a hit of a devaluation. You know, when you talk about Cuba monetary unification, okay, you unify, but then the next and more important question, what is going to be the value of the domestic currency vis-a-vis a convertible currency like the US dollar, and what is the system that you're going to use to get to that point. Well, let me hold that for the moment. The first case I wanted to talk about, and this is a bit of my career going back, Uganda in 1979, after the fall of Idi Amin. We had a country pretty much in a major crisis, exports were not flowing, there was a hugely overvalued exchange rate. And to get that country moving, you have to set the exchange rate right. So after a lot of discussions, we finally convinced the Ugandans to float the currency. They had to float in a foreign exchange market. That meant essentially that the central bank was going to auction the reserve, the dollars, the British pounds, to 4 or 5 commercial banks that existed in Uganda. And that auction will determine the exchange rate. Accompanied with that, there was a fiscal policy position that tried to hold the line and a monetary policy doing the same. That worked, and that I give as an example of a program that you need to increase production in a country. In the case of Uganda, was coffee production. And the coffee was being exported, was being smuggled to Kenya, and not being exported officially because the exchange rate was lousy. And until they did that, the country did not start going. Now, Uganda, believe it or not, in 1979, after Idi Amin, has had some advantage over Cuba today, because it had commercial banks, private commercial banks, and it had a private sector. So once they did the devaluation, the supply effect came through, and the country started recovering. So the lesson for Cuba is it's not only monetary unification, it's not only a devaluation. You really have to have the other elements, the macro policy backing up that effort, and start eliminating some of the red tape so that the economy can work efficiently. Second example, Argentina, early 80s, under the military dictatorship. The fund missions will go to Argentina and try to understand the exchange rate policy, with the emphasis in trying to understand. At one point, I counted that there were about 27 exchange rates in Argentina. And the central bank official, who was actually a very open fellow, he would very patiently explain to me how each of the exchange rate came about, what does that mean, the central bank, each regulation. And when I asked, but why do you do this? He would laugh at me and say, no, the why is more difficult to say, Lorenzo. I can tell you what we're doing. And what they were doing essentially was giving subsidies to the firms, to the sectors that were in cahoots with the military government. This is happening, my understanding that this is happening in Cuba. Maybe they don't have 27 exchange rates, but they have several exchange rates tied to certain sectors of the economy that receive that subsidy. So the point that, this is something that has to go, and it has to go to make any sense in the economy. You have to have one exchange rate, whether it's the Cuban peso or the Cuban convertible peso, or it's a new Guajiro peso, that it has to be one exchange rate to really clean up the economy. The same thing is happening. It happened a number of years in Venezuela. Rafael mentioned the various exchange rates they have, and we know what are the effects that has contributed to the mess in Venezuela. Another example I have is of another Caribbean island. I rather don't mention the name, that they also had the peso-dollar relation 1-to-1 a la cubana since the beginning of the Republic, and it was really completely out of line. And the IMF was discussing a program with this Caribbean island, and they agreed to, and finally, with a lot of effort, they decided to move the exchange rate to the value. But in that particular island, the authority, the monetary authorities, make sure that they sold a significant amount of the dollar reserve to their own company, private companies. So, and that was essentially took a large chunk of the international reserve for that country. That can happen in Cuba too. Cuba has foreign exchange reserve. So watch out when they decide to take an exchange rate action, that that money is not sold at subsidized rates to the privileged firms in Cuba. So that's something that in terms of the welfare of the country has to be kept in mind. And then finally, a more modern, in my last work in the IMF in 2009, I was sort of supervising and monitoring the work on Armenia. And Armenia, even though it had been a centralized economy, it was pretty much a mixed economy in 2009. There were powerful interests in the country, but they needed to make an exchange rate adjustment. Nothing would work. And finally, again, Armenia had a banking sector, private sector, ready to exploit a more favorable exchange rate, and they floated the currency. And that pretty much did the trick, So what I'm trying to emphasize here, that you cannot invent things, let's do this a gimmick, or the World Bank example. Yes, it's a disastrous proposal in terms of what they were trying to do. You have to do a clean exchange rate action, and do it accompanied by supporting policies. Now, let me say make a couple of comments about Cuba. If I remember correctly, something that we don't talk too much about is that in 1993, when they allowed circulation of the dollar, up to that time, and correct me if I'm not correct, if I'm not right, but up to that time, the Cuban peso was worth a US dollar. And at that time, all of a sudden, they made the Cuban pesos 20 pesos to the dollar. Now, this is the largest evaluation in Latin American history for those portions of the population, el hombre de la calle, que no gana dólares, he wasn't in state enterprises. So he starts seeing the impact of the 20-to-1. Now, we're talking about what's going to happen to the Cuban economy if there is a devaluation. I mean, we see in the black market, there's a black market in Cuba now, and the peso of the crook is devaluing. The question is, when you do this adjustment, when you do an exchange rate devaluation, what are the policies that you're going to have supporting this? And Roberto Orro mentioned this, that who's going to help? Well, they need some obviously, to do a successful devaluation, which is badly needed. They need some financial support, balance of payment support, and the government needs to take action to protect or help the people who are going to be affected by the large devaluation. Now you tell me, well, Cuba doesn't have that. Well, Cuba doesn't have that for political reasons, but it's up to the Cuban people to change the political reasons too. I mean, we are living in a very complicated world. Cuba got a break 2 years ago with the Paris Club. Now they had to stop. They got a 6-month reprieve by not servicing the debt to the Paris Club, but that's running out too. So they're really in a very difficult position. But this is not rocket science. This is not rocket science what needs to be done. And with this, I end. Thank
you. I will now ask the rest of the panelists to let me know if they have some question or comment that they would like to make on the various presentations. I'll start in the same order that they were presented. So, Roberto, do you have something to say? Let me unmute him.
Do you need the question, Pavel?
I need to unmute him so that he can talk. Yeah, I need your help.
¿Se escucha?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, sí.
No. No, come here, come here. I don't know why.
Estabas bien,
I'm going
Roberto.
to mute Roberto. Orro.
Vete a la derecha arriba, Roberto. Vete a la
Mute.
derecha arriba.
Host, el host, es el host.
Okay, now you're on. No, no. I think he just muted himself again.
For some reason, we're not being allowed to unmute Roberto. Roberto, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, go to the top right and you will see
Now?
the
Now?
mute on it.
Yes, now we can hear you.
Ah,
Yes.
ok, ok. Ok,
You
tres
all
cositas.
you all can unmute yourselves.
Ok, pero ya se escucha.
Sí.
Bueno, tres cositas rápidas. Uno, no, el problema de que no es solo un problema de déficit monetizado que impide que el gobierno de Cuba quiera embarcarse en una unificación. Yo creo que es importante, y lo he reiterado, hay que acabar de entender de que el gobierno es el que maneja los dólares, es el dueño de la red dolarizada. Es decir, el gobierno no quiere correr riesgos cambiarios. ¿Ok? El gobierno es el que maneja los dólares. En ninguno de estos, en ningún país, ni en la Unión Soviética, ni en Corea del Norte, en Cuba, en todos ellos existe una economía dual, una economía en la moneda y otra economía con el exterior, con empresas en el exterior. Esas empresas tienen que operar en hard currency y eso no se mezcla. Eso es una Biblia del sistema comunista. Esos mundos no se mezclan. Es decir, que es un problema, es importante entender este factor. Otra vez, yo estoy en desacuerdo con esos planteamientos de que hubo una de-dollarization entre el 2004. Si fuese así, la pregunta sería, ¿en qué moneda operaba el gobierno cubano? ¿Usaba el gobierno cubano el peso cubano para operar, operar y negociar con el exterior? ¿Servía el peso cubano como un mecanismo de inversión? ¿Servía el peso cubano como un store of value, sobre todo para el gobierno? ¿En qué mantenía sus reservas? Es decir, el CUC fue un mecanismo de impositivo. Y por último, el otro aspecto es, otra vez, insisto, ese término de decir se crearon distorsiones. Si uno dice se crearon distorsiones, quiere decir que eran unas distorsiones económicas que no existían antes. Y existían y mucho más. ¿Sí? La pregunta es, ¿había más distorsiones adicionales económicas en el 93 con respecto a las que había entre el 70 y el 93? Mi opinión es que no. Es todo.
Joaquín, tú estás mute.
We're going to now turn to Pavel.
Ahí.
Pavel,
Quédese todo el mundo mute, por favor.
Pavel, stop trying. Let me see if I can unmute you for a minute. No, you're gonna have to mute yourself. You're unmuting yourself, but then you're muting yourself right away. So just hit it once. Just hit the unmute button once. No, you're still on mute. Try one more time. Now, it keeps going, it takes him back. It's taking him back. Hold on. Let me try to go to the bottom and see if I can unmute you from here. Hold on. For some reason, it's not letting me unmute you.
Yeah, For a minute, it was okay, and then it went back to mute.
Okay, guys, you need to let him unmute himself. If everybody's trying at the same time to unmute, don't will work. Let Pavel unmute himself.
Got there. Oh, but for some reason, he can only do it for a second.
There you are.
Now?
Now, yeah, now it's okay.
Okay, let me present those two comments. First, because I was able to participate in the paper from the World Bank. They were in Cuba and we were in Washington, and we participated in that proposal. And I think that let me to defend a little bit the World Bank, the rationale behind the proposal, no, that in which with which I read at that time, no. We know we have to implement a significant devaluation. I mean, when you take into account the history of multiple exchange rate systems in Latin America, Cuba has one of the one that have one of the biggest gap between the two exchange rates, between the official and the informal or market exchange rate. So we have to conduct exchange rate devaluation of more than 20 times. And Augusto was checking the history of this exchange rate unification in different countries, and they found out that in every cases when you liberalize the exchange rate market, the equilibrium or the final exchange rate, it tends to be closer to the highest exchange rate. That's why they made the proposal with 25 to 1 and not with an intermediate exchange rate. The other rationale or reason why they presented this proposal is that Cuba is not member of any major international financial institution. Cuba doesn't have enough foreign reserve. So you need to mitigate the impact of such devaluation. You need to soften the blow. You have to protect to some extent, you have to protect the losers. And that's why they organized this tax system to tax the windfall and with that money to protect the loser. But I agree with Rafael that they didn't go into the specifics on how this is going to be implemented. There are many flaws connected to the details, the specifics of the proposal. But my main critique to the proposal is not about the implementation, which is very challenging. Is that I think that that in any strategy or plan that we have to unify for the exchange rate system, I think that the end have to be to restructure the state-owned enterprises. I think that the burden of the economy, and Lorenzo mentioned that we did have a significant devaluation at the early 90s. People, the private sector adjusted to a bigger devaluation at that time because it was an informal devaluation. Then the CADECAs assumed the informal exchange rate. But in the early 90s, the exchange rate went from 5 to the dollar to 150. And then it was like overshooting, and then it was a correction, and then CADECA assumed this exchange rate. But what happened at that time is that this exchange rate adjustment never applied to state-owned enterprises. And that's the adjustment that we've been postponing over and over. And I think that that's the main goal of any exchange rate adjustment. You have to transform because I mean, by any accounts, maybe 1/3 of 50% of state-owned enterprises, they are not profitable. They're just there. They are because they are subsidized with the exchange rate. So that's the thing that you need to change. And if you manage the winners and losers and everything remains the same, and you do not produce any structural change, for me the monetary reform is pointless. That's the main objective. And the other objective is that you need to promote a balance of payment correction. You need to use the exchange rate as a mechanism to foster import substitution and to foster export. And that's why the monetary reform has to be in conjunction with the structural reforms that allow enterprises, private and state-owned enterprises, to have the room to respond to that incentive. They need to make the most of the devaluation, because the other side is the negative impact, or the distress, or the volatility that this is going to create. But on the flip side, you have the benefit, and that's why you are doing a devaluation. You want to get the benefit of the devaluation, and that's why it's so important that the monetary reform happens in concert with a structural reform of the enterprise system. That will be my comment.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm going to ask Omar Everleny to comment now.
Omar, why don't you try to unmute yourself in the corner?
Ya. Lo mío va a ser muy breve porque no quiero repetir lo que han planteado los colegas anteriores. Yo sí creo que cuando en Cuba se empezó a hablar de desdolarización, estaba relacionado en que se eliminaba de la circulación el uso del dólar, o sea, comercio minorista. Y creo que fue un buen mecanismo el surgimiento del CUC. El problema es que si viola los postulados del mecanismo, ahí fue el problema, porque se suponía, si era una moneda CUC, una moneda convertible, tenía que tener garantía a nivel de banco que por cada CUC que se emitiera, y ese fue el origen, debería haber en el banco, en la reserva, $1. Pero si el mecanismo se te fue y empezaste a emitir más CUC que capacidad de exportación, que capacidad de ingresos, y yo logré saber en algún momento que se logró emitir más de 4,5 veces CUC por cada dólar que había, realmente tenías un papelito que le decías convertible, que pensabas que era convertible, que podías comprar en una tienda, pero las tiendas lo único que le habían autorizado a comprar era el 10%, porque ante esa crisis inventaron el CL, que el CL no fue más que decir, no, ya el CUC como tal, el 100% no vale, lo que vale es el 10%, porque lo que autorizaban a las tiendas a comprar era el 10% de lo que recaudaba. Entonces, se complejizó más el asunto. O sea, no. Entonces, hoy sigues diciendo CUC, tienes que quitarle la palabra C, no es convertible. ¿Y para qué sigues teniendo entonces esas instituciones diciéndole CUC si al final es lo mismo CUC que CUP? Elimina el CUC, quédate con el CUP, y al final la que sigue valiendo, como decía Orro, es el dólar, porque el dólar es la única que nos sirve para hacer transacciones, porque ninguna de las monedas cubanas son convertibles. Entonces, realmente todavía es más complejo todos los mecanismos creados que se crean con un fin noble, y Pavel seguro que me lo va a decir, pero después si lo distorsiona pensando que estás trabajando en otra economía separada del mundo y no te das cuenta es que tú eres parte del mundo. Eso es lo que tengo que comentar.
Una pregunta que yo tengo para Omar o para Pavel. ¿Cuánto es la cantidad de CUC que el Banco Central ha emitido? ¿Eso se publica normalmente?
No, eso no se publica. Lo que sí te puedo decir es que en conversaciones, nosotros como economistas nos relacionamos mucho, que se suponía que había una emisión que estaba muy relacionada en un inicio con la cantidad de dólares que estaba en reservas en el país. Y lo que sí sabemos que eso se fue de la mano. Se fue de la mano. Había un número X y lo que se hizo fue 4X. Entonces ahí sí fue donde ya realmente hubo una distorsión total, porque la escasez que hoy estamos pasando ya se venía observando hace 4 o 5 años. El golpe duro fue en el 2019, que se suma la crisis de combustible, pero se suma también la carencia de finanzas del país. Y era porque la gente decía, pero si yo tengo CUC, ¿cómo que las tiendas están vacías? Y yo decía, pero es que tú no tienes moneda convertible, aunque diga moneda CUC, moneda convertible. La empresa que te tiene que suministrar esos recursos no tiene las divisas. Entonces, no importa el número exacto, lo que importa es que se imprimió mucho más de lo que tenía la economía como capacidad realmente para comprar en el exterior, hacer importaciones, etc. No te escucho.
Joaquín,
You
está
have to
muted.
unmute.
Ya.
I want to see the questions.
We're going to the questions right now.
Yeah, you have some very good questions there.
Okay, we have this one. This one.
Okay. One of them is, will the Cuban government allow its citizens to safely bank their own US dollars?
Oh.
Well, that's one question. Let me go to some of the others. Dollarization is a reply to balance of payment crisis. What would be a better way to deal with this crisis? That's a general question, but let me go on. The other question is, what does re-dollarization mean for currency use by foreign consumers, tourists? If Biden is elected, COVID permitting, there will be a quick restoration of US travel by cruises, groups of tours of independent visitors. Kamala Harris co-sponsored legislation which would entail end all travel restrictions. This passage would open real holiday tourism to beach resorts. Americans would prefer to pay bills for restaurants and souvenirs in dollars. Will they be able to do so? And I think, hold on a second, there's one more.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah, no, that's just a comment. Which money-losing state-owned enterprises, impending currency normalization, should be privatized first through international competitive bidding, hopefully supervised by international financial institutions? Okay, I think that. These are the main questions that we have received. There might be others, but if you could, anybody wants to comment on that, let me know.
Bueno, con respecto, regarding the first question, is it safe to put your US dollars at a government account? I don't recommend that. I'd rather keep my dollars in my house or, backyard, but this is suicidal.
Under the mattress.
Exactamente.
We can't trust the Cuban government, to put our money. And nobody's going to do that. Okay, I'm sure the Cuban people will keep dollars, before the mattress, beneath the mattress. That's the best choice.
Can I say something about dollarization? I think Luis was asking what are the alternatives. I would like to introduce a word of warning about dollarization, because when you dollarize an economy, you essentially lose an instrument, monetary policy. So you only have fiscal policy. You really have to have a very strong fiscal policy, which Cuba does not have, to dollarize. Going back to one point that Pavel said, I agree completely. The problems are the state enterprises. But Raúl Castro promised to do something about this 15 years ago, more or less. And apparently nothing has happened much. So Cuba is in a very difficult position because they need to do an exchange rate adjustment. Dollarization is not the panacea. So, you know, and they don't have the political relation to join the international financing institution. So they are in a very hard position, but at the end of the day, some of these public enterprises are going to have to be closed down if they're only alive because they have exchange rate subsidy.
Next question.
On the question of whether people are willing to have dollars deposited, say in the central bank or in some bank in Cuba, you know, you now have these new cards that are being issued supposedly for people that deposit and that they can be used then to purchase in these special stores. Any comment on that?
Just want to comment that I have a different view, no, for my experience working at the central bank. One of the first jobs that I did in the central bank was to register the CADECA operation. And what we saw in CADECA is that when it was like a bad news. Bush was trying to do something with remittances, any rumor. The reaction of the people was the opposite as expected. People withdrew money from the bank, but they go to put the money in the bank. Why? Because they remember that in the two currency substitutions that we implemented in the latest over the decades, one in the 60s and the other was the de-dollarization, the government respected and protect the money in the banks. That's why that's one of the assets of the maybe the only one that the Cuban government has to conduct the monetary unification, because people still trust in the banking system, and you can see now people are using the bank accounts to buy in these new stores. So I know that it's difficult to say, to praise anything about the Cuban government sometimes, but in this case, it's my experience. And I would like to add, because I was at the central bank at that time, that I see that we advance in a de-dollarization. I mean, that the one government to have your reserve, foreign reserve in dollars or participate in international operation in dollars, it's normal. That's a normal situation in any economy. It doesn't mean that you are dollarized.
But they don't have convertible currency. They are not using a convertible currency.
If you want to point to the control mechanism that the Cuban government has to prevail, to maintain the monopoly in the economy, it's not the dollar. It's the multiple exchange system, exchange rate system. That's the key factor.
But
that's why they've been postponing the devaluation.
They have never conducted transactions with the foreign government enterprise with Cuban pesos.
But it's normal. Colombia government doesn't.
But you have an exchange rate. You have an exchange rate. You have a convertible. But you have a convertible exchange rate. You have a convertible currency in Colombia. You don't have a convertible currency in Cuba. Never had. You never have. We have never had.
That's other thing. No convertibility is a different thing. Dollarization is a different thing. So two separate things.
I don't think they are intertwined. It's strongly the problem, because the lack of convertibility is one of the reasons, because they operate in US dollars. They don't trust their currency. That's the problem.
Sorry, on mute.
Joaquín, mute.
You have to unmute, Joaquín.
Ahora, ya.
Estás mute, Joaquín.
Lorenzo, you have to unmute yourself if you want to say something.
I was on mute. I was saying that we didn't hear Joaquín. Joaquín, stay on mute for the rest of the session.
Yes.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have anything to add? No?
Actually, I have a quick question. As long as we have these guys on the line, one of the things that I see, by the way, I agree with Pavel. Some of the transactions that Roberto points to would always be in dollars. You would always hold reserves in dollars and so on. So he's right. I think Roberto's right that the Cuban government doesn't trust its convertibility, but perhaps they would hold reserves in dollars and do international transactions in dollars anyway. I think the problem is that they're financing the deficit through this bizarre taxation of multiple exchange rates. Because if they were dollarized, they would also not face any exchange rate risk. And it's what Lorenzo says, they would have to balance their budget, and they don't want to do that. So they go through this entire circus of multiple exchange rates and liquidation certificates and, inspections and the whole thing to hide the fact that they're printing money and confiscating people's wealth. But I wanted to ask Pavel or Omar, when I look at Revolico, which is a Cuban Craigslist, and they have a sheet, they have a site where they auction off divisas, where it's basically over-the-counter transactions where you sell divisas, and Revolico has a 60-day window. So today's August 15th. You could look all the way back to June 15th, and you can see, in June 15th, the peso was about 1.2, 1.3 on average. If you look, there isn't a value at 1.4 on that page, on the 28th page of their Craigslist. But when you look today, they're at 1.4, 1.5. So they're, even over the last 60 days, you should, according to this thing, be seeing significant pressure in Cuba, no? Maybe a 10, 15% devaluation in the last 60 days?
And there are WhatsApp groups, no? Everleny, trading US dollars.
Mira, Revolico es una cosa súper interesante. A veces te ponen unos precios y que tú no lo puedes comprobar si realmente es así, un poco para poner una cota máxima. Pero cuando uno realmente quiere efectuar esa operación, te puede decir, no, ya los vendí, ya lo otro. Y entonces, a nivel de calle, todo el mundo te dice, no, lo estoy vendiendo a 1.25 porque Revolico ya lo tiene a 1.30. Entonces, como es un mercado un poco... a veces hemos tratado de buscar, tengo amigos que quieren ahora comprar dólares y realmente no existe muchas de las informaciones que se publican. Pues uno decía, bueno, si está a 1.40, ¿por qué no aparecen la gente a 1.40? A lo mejor pudo haber sido una transacción, a lo mejor fue una persona que lo puso. O sea, no hay esa gran seriedad para uno hacer un análisis de Cuba basado en lo de Revolico. A veces uno lo ve para ver por dónde anda, pero realmente el promedio en este momento en toda la capital está entre 1.20 y 1.25. Pero en Revolico salió 1.50. Y allí te dice, yo tengo $500 ahora mismo, si los quieres te los doy a 1.40. Cuando lo llama te dice, no, ya los vendí. La pregunta, ¿sería verdad o sería mentira? Es un poco para poner una cota máxima. Entonces yo creo que eso está bastante complejo. No obstante, increíblemente, hace unos días salió en la televisión un operativo, una persona, un cambista privado, que le decomisaron 1 millón entre dólares, entre euros y hasta yenes tenía. Y la policía detecta a través de Revolico su dirección por el teléfono que puso y fueron a su casa y efectivamente tenía maletas de todas las monedas. Y realmente es un caso que salió hace 3 días en la televisión. 1,5 millones tenía. Era un cambista que iba por los diferentes lugares cambiando y sí realmente tenía esa función, se paraba alrededor de los centros comerciales, etcétera. Pero yo creo que la economía que estamos hablando es otra economía más grande. Y una cosa también es La Habana, otra cosa es el interior del país. Pero yo tengo varios puntos. O sea, yo llamo a mi primo en Villa Clara, llamo a mis primos en Oriente y me dicen que hay colas en todas las tiendas en dólares. Entonces, bueno, ya me dice, no solo en La Habana hay colas, sino que en el resto del país también. Pero que Cuba es muy homogénea. Cuando tú no hablas de Cuba, tiene que verlo también desde el punto de vista territorial. No es lo mismo en Guantánamo, que cuando uno analizaba las cifras, las ventas en Cadeca, podía tener el 0,1%. Entonces eso no te marca. Realmente cuando uno va a hacer un análisis, yo creo que de La Habana, lo que sí está claro es que el Estado, en una política, puedo decir pragmática, no inteligente, porque lo hubiera hecho así a mucho tiempo, reconoció que del país estaban saliendo entre 3.000 y 4.000 millones de dólares anualmente. Y una de las formas que él vio, es decir, ¿por qué voy a beneficiar al privado internacional y no voy a beneficiar al privado cubano? Lo beneficia de lo siguiente: un Sprint se vendía en $600 en La Habana después de traerse de Panamá, y el Estado lo está vendiendo en 300. Entonces la persona se ahorra el 50%. Entonces, hay muchas cosas en el caso de la economía cubana desde el punto de vista financiero que es complejo, porque por otro lado, lo que me decía, no hay estadísticas, no se publican. Entonces, los economistas son economistas, pero necesitamos algún dato. Entonces, tú no me puedes publicar una balanza de pago de hace 5 años atrás, cuando yo sé que ya esa no es la balanza de pago del país. Entonces, no hay un número en lo cual uno puede hacer una correlación con un margen de seriedad.
Creo que ya
Muy bien. Bueno,
estamos pasados de tiempo.
Estamos pasados de tiempo, sí, iba a decir. Así que le agradezco a todos su participación. Creo que ha sido una discusión muy interesante. Y en fin, buenas tardes.
Gracias a ustedes.
Gracias. Saludos a todos.
Gracias, hasta luego.
Buen fin de semana y cuídense del COVID.
Sí.
Sí.
Gracias.
Bueno, un abrazo a todos.